A new documentary from Vice has everyone asking the same question: what actually killed WCW? Well, if you look at the documentary, then it will pose several different answers, from Eric Bischoff to Vince Russo to the executives pulling the plug on the project in 2001, but none of those things single-handedly did the trick. The real thing that killed WCW was the greed and ego of several different people, from the wrestlers, greed from the executives, and greed from the network that didn't actually want the show. And you combine that with the fact that WCW was not profitable for the majority of its time under Time Warner, and you get a recipe for a company that was not long for this world. And when I say greed, I don't just mean that people wanted money. I think people were also greedy for time and the spotlight. You look at someone like Vince Russo. Vince Russo was getting paid a lot of money to write television for WCW. He was in a very good position with the network, and it wasn't until he began putting himself into these programs, putting himself front and center, and really making himself a quote-unquote star of the show, when people really started to blame him for the company's downfall. Because at that point, you saw ratings dip even below where they were before he came in, and it really defeated the entire purpose of bringing in a guy like Vince Russo, because he was supposed to be the one to fix the fledgling ratings that were actually created by the greed of both Eric Bischoff and the wrestlers that he brought in. And this is not saying that WCW did not need Hulk Hogan, Kevin Nash, etc. in order to be successful. Without them, I doubt the Monday Night Wars even play out remotely close the way they did. But along the way, the creative control factors and the almost weekly rubbing it in your face of the NWO got stale, and it got tiresome. And when you go back and look at one of WCW's biggest moments, I think this really encapsulates the essence of what I'm talking about. In the Ring, Starrcade 1997, a moment where, for the first time in over a year, the NWO was supposed to get their comeuppance from Sting, a character that was supposed to symbolize the good of WCW. Instead of having Sting go over clean and having him have this massive moment, there was some doubt created. And it was because Hulk Hogan played his creative control card, something that Eric Bischoff has even confirmed at this point. He played his creative control card in the middle of the ring, changed the finish so that there would be a fast count by the referee that almost illegitimized the decision to have Sting win the match, and created this weird controversy that ruined one of WCW's biggest moments ever. And there was greed like that. There was other instances of pro wrestlers kind of flexing their creative control card when they probably should not, and really holding the company back from moving forward. And then you also have Eric Bischoff. Eric Bischoff, someone who was instrumental and making it into what it was at the height of its success. Without him, we're not talking about WCW. But without him, we're also not talking about some of the failures of WCW. And that weekly rubbing it in your face of the NWO that I mentioned earlier, that was in large part because of Eric Bischoff. Regardless of how great the gimmick was, it was not going to last forever. However, from 1996 all the way through into 1999, they ran with this story without having it really evolve too much. The most that we got was them splitting up into NWO Hollywood and NWO Wolfpack. And even then, there wasn't very clear why the split happened in the first place or what it was supposed to symbolize. It just kind of happened, and there was never a massive blow-off to the split in the first place. So again, you have storylines that Eric Bischoff is in charge of, that Eric Bischoff is managing, that he is trying to make the best television from, that just don't go anywhere. And as cool as it was to get rowdy, bowdy, and all that, the reality is you can only hang on to something being cool for so long before it becomes stale. So Eric Bischoff, of course, deserves some of the blame, but then we also have to talk about the network. And this really was the nail in the coffin of WCW, because as ratings were slipping, you had executives at the network who in the first place were not big fans of professional wrestling. One of the only reasons why pro wrestling was on Turner at the time was because Ted Turner was a fan of the product. And had that not happened, you would not have seen WCW get the primetime Monday night slot that they got. You would not have seen WCW get the money, the hundreds of millions of dollars of cash flow that went their way in the late 1990s without Turner being on board. And over time, they looked at that. They looked at WCW losing money outside of 1996 through 1998. WCW was a money loser, and a big one at that. So for the network, their greed was they did not want to fund a product that, even though this was likely their highest rated show on the network, they did not want to fund something that was bleeding them money. And why I use the term greed is because at the end of the day, Eric Bischoff had a deal with WCW to purchase the company and then bring it back onto Turner Networks in a new fashion. However, the reason we didn't get this was because even though WCW Nitro was one of the highest rated shows in prime time on Turner Networks, they did not want that show on their network. So you had a network that had an ego and greed that made them feel like they were above professional wrestling, even though if they weren't the ones funding the product, they could actually make money from the ad revenue of having WCW on their television network. But that didn't happen. WCW is still dead. It will remain dead. So the answer to the question, what actually killed WCW, truly is greed and ego.